Okay, everyone, all of the metadata enthusiasts, thank you so much for being here at the end of the day. And this session in particular is a great conclusion to the Metadata Summit, because in the end, what we've talked about at the beginning was going from bricks and mortar into digital, and then the innovations, some of the issues that everyone has encountered along the way, the problems that still need to be solved. But in the end, it all comes down to these core identifiers that tell everyone in the industry, in a machine-readable world, who contributed to the song, who made that art, and who deserves to get paid and attributed in a digital environment. So with that, I will hand it over to Abby, and I have asked everyone to make sure to explain some of the acronyms so that everyone in the group has a common baseline. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Vicki. Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying here for the last panel. I know everyone's exhausted. My name is Abby North. I'm a music publisher. I've been building rights management software. So I'm particularly interested in identifiers and linking them. So this panel is making modern metadata standards work. And we're going to ask several questions among our panelists. What can be done to unify metadata systems? Where do data standards like DDEX fit? And then among us, we're going to maybe propose some new metadata standards, connections, and identifiers. So today, we have Mark Isherwood from DDEX. We have Tim Davenport from ISNI. We have Will Kreth from ITER, and Sylvan Piat from CISAC. And while I realize that I know Sylvan, I don't know if any of you have also been on a panel earlier, but if you wouldn't mind giving an introduction about yourselves, but also the entity you work with and maybe its identifiers or role in the ecosystem. Starting with Mark.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mark Isherwood. I'm part of the Secretariat for DDEX, Digital Data Exchange. DDEX is a standards organization for the music industry primarily, and it's all about creating standards for communicating data up and down the entire industry value chain in a common way. So there are a number of different standards, one each, as it were, for specific kind of business transactions. For example, when a label or a distributor needs to get metadata to a DSP, there is a standard message format for that. If a DSP needs to get sales data to a musical work rights society, or to a publisher, there's a standard for that. And so there's about 6 or 7 families of standards that kind of fulfill different roles in the whole ecosystem. One quick plug, if any of you are local, on May the 24th at Vanderbilt University, we will be doing a complete rundown of DDEX and all of its standards. So if any of you want to come along to that, you'd be welcome. It's free of charge. Just email info@ddex.net saying you want to come along to that 24th of May, Vanderbilt University. So no more plugs.
Thank you. And Tim?
Good afternoon. Yes, my name's Tim Davenport. I'm Exec Director of the ISNI International Agency. ISNI is a term, yet another inhabitant of the alphabet soup. It stands for the International Standard Name Identifier. And in that guise, it's another of the group of identifier standards like ISAN and ISBN and others with which you'll be familiar. In the context of the music industry particularly, ISNI has been getting more involved in the music sector over the last 18 months to 2 years, providing unique identification and unique open public identification for various entities in that chain. And so that could be an artist, it could be a composer, it could be a performer. Since ISNI also looks at organizational identification as well, it could be a way of identifying publishers or labels. So those are the kinds of sphere that we're active with. As I say, the standard has been around since around about 2011, 2012, something like that, and it got its first traction in the international libraries of the world, the Library of Congress, the British Library, and various others, where it was used quite heavily in cataloguing operations to actually disambiguate and correctly assign identities to authors of written works. More recently, though, and this has been particularly pronounced since last year when Google YouTube actually approached us to see whether or not ISNI could also be applied within the music sphere. The whole thing has come on by leaps and bounds, and one of the bounds has brought me here today. We'll probably be talking a bit more about how these things work a little bit later on, but that's probably enough for now.
Thank you. And Will, IDER, I think IDER might be one of the newer standards to most people here, because IDER is not necessarily specifically music-oriented, but it's motion picture and television.
That's right. So IDER, the Entertainment Identifier Registry, is now closing in almost 10 years. It's 9 years old, started in 2010. Debuted as a research project from Movie Labs. That's the R&D research group for the motion picture industry. Much like MPAA is part of works with the motion picture industry, Movie Labs is a team of research scientists that looked at the identification namespace for film and television and didn't really see an adequate solution from the business content stakeholder perspective. And also, we made a lot of work, a lot of research outreach into non-commercial works, working with folks like Library of Congress, the British Film Institute. We just signed the American Film Institute. So we have both commercial users like Warner, Disney, Sony, Paramount. Their archives, the library content at the major Hollywood studios are all registered now with IDER IDs for both domestic and international distributed versions. And we also work with major US and international television networks as well too, to create that universal unique ID for the thing itself, the abstraction, and also an ID potentially if you need for an edit. I'll give you one good example real quick. Global Eagle is a company that does in-flight entertainment. You can imagine if there are 12 different languages and your plane, as you're flying somewhere, you choose English, but then you'll see there's Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, French, German, etc. All of those that Global Eagle, this company, handles for the airlines, every version has an IDER ID. So it's a good example of the necessity of being able to disambiguate versions of films in a commercial application. So that's IDER's short story, and we'll get deeper into it a little later.
And then Sylvain Piat.
Yes, so for those of you who are not this morning at the other panel, I'm Sylvain Piat, Director of Business at CISAC, and well, the reason I'm here again this afternoon is because probably CISAC has been very involved in the setting up of standards since the late 90s, when we started what we call the CIS plan, the Common Information System Plan. So that was an initiative by what you call PROs in the US, well, CMOs worldwide, to develop standards for the data exchange between societies. So this is where we started to develop ISWC, ISNI, but also ISIN for the audiovisual, which is a competitor to ADR, but also working together now, more or less.
Yeah.
And so we have developed a number of standards for the identification, for data exchange, and so we have always been very active in this field. And so I'm happy to be here again to speak about ISWC this afternoon.
Thank you all. So I'm, like I said, a music publisher. So my focus often is on the ISWC, the standard identifier for the composition. But as a song travels through the world, if it is not associated with a recording, it's very difficult to track that use. So for me, I question the ways in which we might be able to link a sound recording and a composition better than we've been doing now. So one of the things I look at is if we start from the point of creation. So a songwriter is in the room, in the studio, recordings are happening. If we might benefit from the use of things like RIN plugins. Mark, could you talk about the RIN standard?
Sure. So the recording information notification standard, which is one of DDEX's, is slightly different from everything else. All our other standards are communication standards, so kind of point-to-point exchange of data. RIN is a bit more like just a file. I sometimes compare it to a bucket into which you pour more and more metadata. And the idea is that it's used in digital audio workstation software and enables people to add metadata about what's going on in a studio. In that sense, it's geared a little bit more to the sort of old way of creating new content, but it can be just as easily used in something like GarageBand. And the idea is, as the file of audio moves around in going through different processes, the RIN file goes with it, and at every step of the way, more metadata gets put in it until we get to the point where the audio is complete and everybody's happy. That can then get ingested into the supply chain of record companies, of publishers, of copyright societies, so that as much data as possible is being gathered from the first moment of creation, so that you just keep gathering it as the process goes through. Because one of the problems that the whole industry has had is actually sourcing the data in the first place. And so that's what the RIN standard is there for. We're very grateful to a number of companies who've adopted this and created plugins for studio technology. And it is starting to be used extensively. There's a lot more to do, but it's a beginning in terms of a mechanism for early capture of data. One of the projects that's going on, which is nothing directly to do with DDEX, but involves the RIN standard, is a project being run by a company called Session, whereby they're actually linking the people that are appearing or participating in a studio session with their unique identifiers, like the IPI, the Interested Party Identifier, that's run by CSAC, or the International Performer Number, which is run by an organization called SCARPRA, which is probably the worst acronym I've ever heard. But they're the grouping of performer societies like Sound Exchange here and PPL in the UK, and linking people who are participating in the creation of content with their international numbers that early in the process is quite a game changer in terms of gathering all the data we need in order for the royalty processing to take place effectively, and also the attribution, which is so important. So there's a number of moving parts there, not all associated with DDEX, but RIN is the core of it.
Thanks. So the types of metadata that might be in a RIN plugin profile. As a user, I can set up my profile. Within my profile, if I am let's say I'm the performer and I'm the writer, I can already pre-populate with my IPI, my IPN if I have it. If I'm working at a studio, I would populate with my client's identifiers. But one of the questions, so there's this issue of a sound recording being released into the world, and then the world not knowing who the songwriters are, who the publishers are, and what their respective shares are. So, Sylvan, what are the updates to ISWC that will allow creators at that point of release, maybe, to have an ISWC to include in their RIN plugin?
Yes. So, well, I mean, this is what we are trying to change at the moment, indeed, because what we have seen for the last couple of years is that we have more and more requests, demands from the different people, different songwriters, publishers, for a more efficient ISWC, because it used to be until now, before you can allocate an ISWC, you need to get we used to, this allocation of IWC was part of the work registration process within societies, okay, and it's still the case. And as part of this process, you need to have all the information needed to register a work, including, for example, the shares, including the publisher information, okay, or, for example, in other territories, the sub-publishing information. But in practice, it doesn't work in this digital environment because you need to allocate the IWC at the time of the creation. So we started to address this issue like almost, 1 year and a half ago, and we started to interview, for example, different players of the music industry, including record companies, publishers, DSPs like Spotify, YouTube, Apple, to see, where we need to fill the gaps, okay? And what we could identify is that we need to make those rules more flexible, and we need to find a new process by which you can assign IWC as soon as you know only, let's say, only when you can identify the creators. Only when you can identify the creators themselves, the songwriters, okay? Excluding publishing information or shares and everything. So. And this is what we call the IWC allocation service, where you can allocate an IWC as quickly as possible in the process, and possibly at the time of the recording. Mark was explaining about the Session Audley initiative, and we are talking to them to see, how we could embed this process into the Audley system. Mm-hmm. So, of course, it's not easy because it implies changes in how stakeholders are working, And for me, this is also a point I wanted to make at this panel, is that identifiers is one thing, data exchange standardization is another thing, but really what is important as well is to better understand the processes. What are the processes and what are the use cases that would justify the use of identifiers, okay, and how they can participate in these processes. And this is really the complicated part of the analysis.
So in practice, we need a standard identifier, a globally unique identifier for a song.
Yeah.
And then we need that song to be associated with any recordings of that song, right? Yeah. But what happens with that ISWC in this new allocation practice if I start a song and there's 3 of us in the room, and then at the next session, so we have 3 people, we register among the 3, and then we get into the room a week later and add a writer.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, indeed, that's one issue. This is one of the issues that we have with the current ISWC system, okay? And because it's not very flexible in terms of allocation rules. And in the new systems that we are developing, I don't know, many of you probably have seen some press release about our cooperation with the Spanish Point, a company based in Dublin, and that will help us to develop the new ISWC system. We have just approved the more or less some specifications for this new system that will allow for more flexibility so that you can assign ISWC, get some metadata related to this, and maybe later in the process there will be some changes, additions, new people coming in, and then you can really have a more flexible approach to add more information to the original set of metadata.
That's great. Yeah. So Will, will you kind of explain how IDER works in that it's a sort of a bucket of data, and can you fill us in on what's included in that bucket?
Yeah, so it's kind of a 3-part hierarchy. We have to bring out the T-word taxonomy. The structure of a top level, which would be the abstraction, the thing itself. Let's say, the movie Get Out, right? And then there are versions or edits below that, which could have each could have a unique IDER ID assigned to them. An IDER ID is essentially like it's a 36-digit alphanumeric code that's randomly assigned. It doesn't mean anything unless you look it up. But that edit for the French, German, Spanish, whatever, each one of those could have an IDER ID. And then there's a 3rd level, which is manifestation or encoding. So we just had a success story that's going around the fact that Austin City Limits, there's a 40+ years of the KLRU Austin public television station. They have registered all of their episodes and all of their, so it's the series, seasons, episodes. And they've also registered subclips from the show. It's a great example because you got songs that divide neatly into different individual clips. And then you've got the masters itself, and you've also have then the encoding. Back then it might be standard definition before HD, and you can then register the encoding of that particular version. There may have been like an up-res later or a high definition version later or something like that, but originally there was a standard definition version. So that's kind of the three-part taxonomy of ITER.
Okay, so we have the series, we have, let's say, a season,
Yeah.
and then episodes within
And that's television, yeah.
television
Right.
would be the same.
Yeah. So I mentioned, you could have IDs for all three of those, and IDs for the the edit, and the encoding.
Okay, so I have an episode, and within that episode, I have synchronized a bunch of music.
Mm-hmm.
And that episode has an associated cue sheet. So in that cue sheet, I'm storing information about the works that are synchronized, whether they are instrumental or with vocals. I've got the information about the entitled parties, maybe their shares, maybe. I have information about the type of use. Is it a main title theme? Is it a background vocal? And I have the duration of the use. So that cue sheet is associated with an ITER ID.
That's what we would like to see. 3 years ago, my boss and our former now board member, Kip Welch, came here and was talking to the organization, to music business, saying, please, use ITER in your cue sheets. We are proud to announce today that we have a new partnership that hit the wire this morning with DDEX, with Mark over here, in a liaison level where we're going to be working more closely with DDEX around helping define and streamline the process of associating ITER IDs from audiovisual works with the music industry ID schemes.
So I know that ITV has hundreds of thousands of programs that have ITER IDs associated with each, and they have cue sheets associated with each, and there has been a program with PRS and SoundMouse to streamline the process, I guess the ingestion of the cue sheets, the processing of those cue sheets, and then the subsequent royalty distributions. Can you speak to how that streamlining has been working?
We hear well. I don't have direct first-hand knowledge because I'm not in London, but ITV is like the third or fourth largest UK broadcaster, correct?
Yes.
Second.
You gotta keep me honest here, guys.
Yeah, second, I think.
And they are huge fans of ITER and have been. We work with their teams in just technically helping them with regards to registration or any corner cases or issues that might come up with the registration process. But they're working with SoundMouse is also an ITER member, and then we mentioned PRS, I think, a little earlier. So in that round trip of data, I'd like to also mention a US example, if that's okay?
Please.
Yeah, so with Google, Google Play is their storefront for transactional video on demand, much like you might purchase a rental of a hit movie on Apple TV. Google Play allows you to do a similar thing. Google, 2 years ago, set forth a policy saying all titles, everything that plays on that is listed on the storefront, because they're a digital retailer, for Google Play would have an ITER ID assigned to it. So whether they received one from, let's say, Lionsgate or a major other studio, or whether they had to assign it themselves, they took it upon themselves to do so. And that way, then, they were able to have data normalization, a standard level of commitment to the data quality of what is then sent back to the studios or to the networks and saying, your movie or your television episode was purchased X number of times. And, oh, by the way, here's an ITER ID with it. So you've got a machine-readable code to do reporting and dashboards and be able to automate the process of saying how well that property is doing.
And then I look at the next step there, where most studios own at least the underlying score because most of it was created as a work for hire. So the studios now know with granular data how the music that they control that's within the productions they control has been used. And they can now look at the societies that distribute, let's say, broadcast mechanicals or streaming,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
That's the beautiful thing about linked data, in that we start to see different data registries starting to interoperate and starting to work together to help automate processes that might have been manual processes with spreadsheets and title matching and someone trying to go from here to there and saying, okay, look, this can be done at an API level where we can have a machine-to-machine conversation where we don't have to do a breakdown into Excel and spreadsheets and manual matching.
And just quickly, and then we're going to move on to Tim, but so you said that you told me that IDER has been talking with some manufacturers about the possibility of a plug-in.
Yeah.
And I realized, I don't know if I can name the manufacturer.
We've been approached by a major DAW maker,
And
workstation maker, about a plugin for their products.
Okay. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but my question is, that manufacturer makes both, or some manufacturers make both digital audio workstations and then video editing suites.
So this narrows it down, I think.
Would a plugin, if I'm exporting if I have a plugin on a video editing system,
Yes.
does that include, let's say, the EDL, the edit decision list data?
Well, it's really it's flexible, however you want to structure it, right? So it's linked structured data. So the sense of saying, okay, we want to do an API. You can have the plugin could do an API call to do a resolve, and a resolve API call to say, oh, is this the title we think it is that we're working on this new property for HBO or for Showtime or whoever? And then they do the call and say, oh yeah, it is. It correctly matches, and the data looks good. And then that way, we have this notion of like itered inception that. And I think this is something to what the music industry is on too, and we heard Paul Jessup talking about earlier today. Get it early, get it right, and get it attached to the property so that it travels throughout its life cycle in a accountable attribution level connection to the asset through its all the different parts of the supply chain, of the value chain.
Mark, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say about the sort of partnership one of the problems is that the way in which the audiovisual industry structures its data is different from the way in which the music industry structures its data. So actually, probably at the moment, we couldn't talk to each other. So the sorts of things that we want to look at in this partnership is how can we align the way in which we structure the data so that we can actually talk to each other smoothly on a machine-to-machine basis. And that could apply just as much across to the text publishing industry, where we try and align things that we have in common, and obviously music is in common very much with AV. And if we can see align each other's data structures, then that's going to go a long way to making the whole thing more efficient and better for all the rights owners.
So let's move on to ISNI. In order to disambiguate creative parties, we can look to ISNI.
Yes, yeah. We've got various mechanisms in place for this. First of all, I should back up just a little to say that ISNI is a member organisation. We have about 45 member organisations, each of which specialise in different disciplines, sometimes different territories, that kind of thing. The reason I mention this now is that the registration agencies, which form about 20 of the total of these organisations, are our first line of defence in terms of these disambiguation operations. We then run various algorithmic checks on the metadata that's submitted, but crucially what they're running against are things like supporting metadata, not only the name which we're averring is a certain name, but it could be, for instance, in the case of an artist's birth and death dates, or countries in which they were active. It could also look out to supporting creative works that that artist or that creative person has been responsible for, whether this is actually represented by an ISWC, or one thing that we're really excited about at the moment is a recent collaboration with Sound Exchange, whereby we're going to be looking at lots of the data that Sound Exchange are making available to us, and the supporting ISRCs, which is almost a good way of fingerprinting whether we have the right attribution, the right identity that we're assigning within our database.
And can we talk about how ISNI might be a bridge or a link among other identifiers?
Indeed, yeah. I think the first thing is to recognize that it's no surprise that there are multiple identifier schemes out there. We might wish that this was not the case, but that's our starting point, realistically. You know, my 1, 2, 3 from my spreadsheet might be the same as 4, 5, 6 in Abby's Christmas card list. I don't know, but they could relate to the same identity. ISNIs are actually assigned in a very structured way and in a very public way as well. So you can almost check back on our reasoning for an ISNI assignment by studying the associated metadata. Since the identifier is publicly available, it can be used to facilitate, for instance, crosswalks between other identifier systems. And this may include even the proprietary identifiers that each of you use within your own organizations. Which, you know, there are public identifiers, there are identifiers that are very widespread but are not publicly available, and there are entirely proprietary systems. In each case, we hope that ISNI can be used to actually facilitate links between them and say, hey, this is the ISNI that corresponds to that one from this particular schema and this one from that particular schema.
Thank you. So coming back to the IDER model where there's this bucket of data, could we apply that to the music business? And what would that look like? Could we have a single identifier, let's say, that is the associator, the link, among all of them, the ISRC, the ISWC, the IPI, the ISNI, the IPN, and would that help?
I mean, my view of that, the short answer is no. The film industry particularly has the benefit of they have unitary rights. So the guy at the top owns everything, even if they've got to make payments to millions, literally thousands and thousands of people. The music industry doesn't have unitary rights. So there's the sound recordings, there's the musical works, there's the composers, there's the performers, then the different types of rights in different territories. So linking them all together with one identifier, I can't see that happening. Linking them together, however, is the key. And there's a lot of that goes on even now. Every musical work rights society links works to sound recordings. Every performer organization links sound recordings to performers. The problem is that there will often be a lot of difference between those links. And the sort of El Dorado for me over the next few years is, can we, as an industry, agree rules around authority, whereby we all say, on the basis of these rules, we believe that this is the most authoritative link between these two things. And then you can write that into code, and it can be done automatically. I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do, but I think it is doable. And there are projects already going on which are not really industry-wide, but being done within small groups that are looking at things like authority rules between linking sound recordings to musical works. And, you know, that to me is where we've got to go to next as an industry, is looking at ways in which we can all trust each other around a set of authority rules, and then start using those links as a public good rather than them being behind firewalls in private databases.
So then YouTube, as a publisher, I would deliver my data to YouTube. I would tell them in my data what the associated or linked ISRC is. And then they have a new identifier that bridges those two, so that an asset ID that is the identifier for the relationship between the composition and the sound recording. Is that something we might see happen at CMOs?
Well, yes and no. I mean, as Mark explained, ideally, it would be great. If we would have those links available to let's say, as a global registry of linking musical works to sound recording, then you don't need anymore this content ID or this asset ID from YouTube, because you can use this identifier for linking the two assets, so sound recordings and musical works. And I'm even wondering why it doesn't exist already, okay? Because we have been talking about this for years now. And but as a matter of fact, I mean, ideally it should be there. In practice, we can see there are many challenges. There are legal challenges. I mean, how can, for example, if a CMO is making the links between musical works and sound recordings, can a CMO make this information available to other parties? I mean, the ISRC doesn't belong to a CMO. It belongs to the label. Okay, so if they want to do it, they have to have the authorization of the label. Okay, and very often as well, they have some restrictions about the use of this data, only for their internal purposes.
What if, let's say, a publishing CMO strategically aligned with, say, Sound Exchange, and Sound Exchange has its publicly accessible database of ISRCs and sound recordings? Might that be a relationship that could work?
So there might be a relationship then at the level of Sound Exchange, but how far this could be considered as authoritative by other CMOs worldwide, I'm doubtful. Okay, it would apply in the US, but it doesn't necessarily apply in other countries.
But this is why it needs to be an industry initiative, because you've got to get everyone to buy into it. When I say everyone, I don't mean everyone at once. That's impossible. But you get a group of people who feel confident enough to create some authority rules that they will all buy into, and then you gradually, through osmosis, you draw people together. But that's the only way that this could be feasible, in my view.
Thank you. We're just about out of time, but I wanted to ask this one question of the panelists, which is, from 1 year ago to today, what advances in metadata and disambiguation and links have you seen that have positively improved, positively changed our royalty collections ecosystem?
Recently?
What's that?
You mean in
What's
the more...
changed in the past year that's been significant?
I think, the main changes we have seen as far as CISAC is concerned is, I would say, more openness. It means that, we can see a change in the position of different stakeholders. They are more ready to share information and to make this information, to participate to some projects. We can see that. It's not perfect yet, of course, but I believe that everybody understands that we have to do something. Okay, we need to find solutions, so they are more open to... And we have seen it, for example, but our system, SysNet, now is open to publishers and creators. 10 years ago, it would have been impossible. But we see more openness in data exchange.
Right. Anybody else?
Well, supporting also the openness that Sylvain was talking about. Call me a little blinkered, but I hope that the introduction of ISNI into this ecosphere has been useful so far. I think there's a great amount of potential that we can use going forward. The other thing, and it pulls in something that you were just asking, Abby, a little earlier. One of our own missions, really, over that period and continuing, is almost making sure that ISNI speaks music, so that we're actually responding not just from a generic background of stuff that we know how to do in other sectors, but that we're speaking in terms that make sense to real use cases within the music industry. Ultimately, it's got to convince you folks that it's a good idea to actually do these things, that it will bring greater efficiency, greater financial reward, whatever it might be. We're on a journey to do that, and that's our little contribution to the total.
I would just say, thankfully, at last, some increased cooperation across places where there used to be walls. And actually, the example you've just given is one of those. Some parts of the music industry viewed ISNI with a certain amount of suspicion. They weren't totally sure that it was going to be valuable to their infrastructure. But now ISNI has a music consultative group. I don't know if that's not the right term, but and so there is a conversation, and that's the only way these things get resolved. Standoffs don't work. So I think there has been a mood change right across the industry and across industries in terms of media as well over the last year or two, and that can only be a good thing.
Great. Thank you all. I really appreciate your participation in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Abby.
And thank you all for attending the Metadata Summit. It's been really great, satisfying. Go get your identifiers. Have a great summit.
But they're forming a line for identifiers now.
Hi, Brad.